Good morning and happy Friday, and thank you for joining me for this live stream. I'm going to talk about the NAR settlement, and I'm using StreamYard here. So please bear with me for a second as I'm going live on multiple platforms here. And it seems we are live everywhere, including on Instagram. Now, if you're on Facebook or any of the other channels, make sure you click on that StreamYard link, especially on Facebook, so I can see your name and I can try and respond to your comments. Otherwise, I won't see the comments, but I will go back and look at every stream and any comments that you guys might have. So here we are. It is July 26th, and in 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks, all of these changes are going into effect here in Florida. Now, even though the changes are going to affect August 17th, supposedly on August 5th, all cooperating compensation is going to be scrubbed from the MLS. And right now, this is really a giant clusterfuck, for lack of better words. So far, we've not gotten any kind of documents on the listing side. So we don't have new listing agreements. We don't have any documents for sellers to sign to amend the current listing agreement, because of course current listing agreements provide that we pay a cooperating compensation on the MLS to the buyer broker. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. This week, I really dug into the buyer agency agreement that FAR has provided us with, and there are so many questions that this opens up. And I'm sure you guys are just as frustrated as I am. So let's dive into it. First of all, starting August, we need to have buyers sign a buyer agency agreement if we're going to work with them and show them property. So without a buyer agency agreement, we can't go and start showing them properties. And the thinking behind this is that, really the relationship between the buyer and the buyer broker, there should be an agreement that determines, okay, what does the buyer broker do for the buyer and how much does the buyer pay for the buyer broker? And that makes all the sense in the world. And to go back in time a little bit, if we look at the history of how this cooperating stuff started and the MLS started in the old days, a long time ago, when you had printouts. This was before my time. I've been in this business now for a little over 22 years, but it used to be that everyone worked for the seller. So if we go back to the beginning of the offer of compensation, a listing broker took a listing, had an agreement with the seller, and then the listing broker was looking for buyer brokers, buyer agents, but those agents would become sub-agents of the listing broker. So they didn't work for the buyer. They represented the seller because they became sub-agents of the listing broker. And as such, the listing broker agreed to split the compensation with that sub-agent. And that makes all the sense in the world. So the buyer really was not represented. They may be working with an agent, helping them find a home and looking at all the things that are offered in the MLS. But when it came down to the legalities, that buyer agent, when they brought a contract, they were acting as a sub-broker of the listing broker. And then somehow all of that faded away, and buyer agents no longer became, or buyer brokers no longer became sub-agents of the listing broker, but they represented the buyer. But the offer of compensation still stuck because everyone was used to the seller paying X% to the listing broker, and then the listing broker sharing the compensation with someone else. So here we are now today, where that is no longer going to be possible, at least the way it used to be. And so I'm going to talk about the buyer side perspective, or buyer brokerage side perspective, for a little bit. And then at the end, I'm going to just quickly dip into the listing side. And by all means, we're not going to cover everything, and I'm going to do a couple of more lives. And if you would like me to invite you on a live and we'll have a discussion, please do. I would love to have a lively discussion with multiple people, maybe even create a panel. But let's talk about the buyer side. So the buyer agency agreement is really modeled after the listing agreement. If you look at it, it's very, very similar. So the buyer engages the buyer broker, and there's compensation. Could be a fixed amount, it could be a percentage, it can be a combination of the two. So you could, charge X percent plus $X, or you can just charge a percentage, or you can just charge a flat fee amount. But here's where it gets interesting. The buyer agency agreement, just like a listing agreement, provides for a cancellation clause whereby the agreement can be conditionally canceled, just like a listing agreement. And the buyer broker may revoke that cancellation, may cancel that, or that conditional withdrawal if the buyer ends up working with someone else. Now, in all reality, on the listing side, if I take a listing and I agree to cancel, quote unquote, withdraw the listing conditionally, there's going to be a notation in the MLS. First of all, any seller or any agent can see, okay, is this property listed with someone? And number two, if the listing is withdrawn conditionally, I can see that. So if I'm an agent going on a listing appointment, I can see if that listing was with another broker previously and it was conditionally withdrawn. And I can let that seller know, listen, I'll be happy to work with you, but do you know that you're also going to have to pay your commission to the prior broker under the agreement that was withdrawn? And so there's a mechanism here to understand that and see what's going on. On the buyer brokerage side, I don't see that happening. Number one, if I'm an agent, how can I verify or see if that buyer is already under agreement with another broker? Okay, I mean, a buyer could run around and sign 5 buyer agency agreements with 5 different agents/brokers, and none of them is the wiser in how we're going to enforce that when that buyer is supposed to bring everything to our attention, and we are supposed to get compensated when they purchase a property, regardless of what they buy, where they buy it. So it's a huge, huge deficiency. And to make matters worse, if we agree to a conditional withdrawal, how can we put people on notice that this buyer agency agreement is conditionally withdrawn? Is there going to be a registration on the MLS where we can register buyer agent agreement that a buyer agent can go into and needs to go into to say, okay, has Jeff Smith already signed an agreement with someone else? So many, many, many questions. And also, how do you enforce that compensation? So I think we're being painted in the corner here as brokers with respect to the buyer side, that we have to comply with these rules, but they're not very well thought through, and nobody really knows how to enforce it. And it's just going to be a shit show, honestly. It's going to be very, very, very confusing. And this is just from the broker's perspective. Now, on the buyer side, the buyer may say, "Oh, I don't want to sign anything. I'm just going to go to open house. I'm just going to go to listing agents," which is probably going to happen. And that brings up another question. So if you're working with a seller right now, and we're going to have compensation negotiated as part of the contract, we can take 2 approaches here. One is, I'm going to take a listing tomorrow, by the way, and I'm discussing this with the seller. So one approach is that, but when these new rules go into effect, do you want to offer compensation to the buyer broker? And if the seller does, then I can communicate that, obviously not in the MLS, but I can communicate it on my website. I can communicate it in emails. I can let buyer agents know if they call me that yes, the seller agrees to compensate $X for towards the buyer agent fee. Again, we don't know yet what the new listing agreement is going to look like because we haven't been provided with it yet. But that is one way. The other way is that we're not going to address this at all. The seller could just say, well, I'm open to it, bring me a contract. And then this is something that's going to have to be negotiated as part of the contract. So the buyer has an agreement with the buyer agent that says, okay, I'm going to be paid X percent. And so when the buyer makes their offer, then in that offer, the buyer could say, seller agrees to pay X percent buyer broker compensation towards the buyer broker as part of the transaction. And so that's another way to address this. And the seller is obviously always going to look at their net. So even if the seller says, I'm not going to pay anything, I'm not going to cover any kind of contributions, at the end of the day, it's all going to wash out when there is a contract on the table and we present it to the seller and say, okay, here is what your net is going to be. I mean, the seller really doesn't care whether they get $500,000 and pay nothing, or whether they get, $510,000 and pay $10,000 towards the buyer broker fee. It really is going to be a wash, but we have no guidance yet on how that's going to wash out. But at least on the listing side, we have some control because we know that the property is listed and it's listed with us, and other agents can see that, which is not the case on the buyer side. Now, instead of making things simpler, at least here in our market area with Stellar MLS, we just received the notification that there's going to be a new concession field in the MLS listing. So if a seller is going to make a concession towards the buyer's closing costs, prepaids, etc., mortgage fees, that can be put into that concession field. However, it cannot be used for compensation. So you can't hijack that concession field and use it to pay for the buyer broker compensation. It's very clear. So my question is, concessions have been around forever now. Why the hell are you bringing it up to now and create a concession field that, we're prohibited from using to, for the communication of buyer agency compensation? And these are some really, really serious issues. There's no grace period. There's going to be a $500 fine automatically if there's a violation. And they have to be really hardcore on that in order to avoid, the agreements of the settlement, the terms of the settlement being violated. But it's a mess. So here we are right now today. On the buyer side, we have a buyer agency agreement that has tons and tons of questions and loopholes, and to me, it creates more questions than answers, and every answer you get from someone creates 5 more questions. And if you popping in late, watch the beginning of the video, but there are some things that you need to really think about as an agent. And when I look at Facebook groups and other places, there's just so much garbage out there with agents trying to come up with these cockamamie ideas of, well, if I just put something in the description and offer my compensation by putting capital letters, or, that's nonsense. I don't have time, honestly, to read any more of these comments, but we need to focus on what we have here at hand right now. And so we have guidance on the buyer side that is very, very partial. In other words, here's a buyer agency agreement. There's always been a buyer agency agreement, so I really don't know why they had to muck with it. But the way they created a new buyer agency agreement just opens up all sorts of questions, because I don't see how we can really be protected as a broker using that agreement. And then we have nothing on the listing side. The only thing we have on the listing side is, number one, you cannot offer any compensation in the MLS, period. You can offer it elsewhere, you can put it on a billboard, you can do whatever you want, but on the MLS, you cannot offer any kind of compensation. And by the way, we have this new field for seller concessions, but you cannot use it for compensation. And if agents and brokers become creative and start offering compensation outside of the MLS, I guarantee you, mark my words, the DOJ is going to have a word to say about it. And their position is very, very clear. They want to prohibit any form of compensation from the seller to the buyer broker. They want to have an environment where the listing agent or broker has an agreement with the seller pays the listing broker for their services, and the buyer agent has an agreement with the buyer, and the buyer has to pay for their services. And it's going to be really the way it is in the rest of the world. And I can tell you from experience, having sold properties in Germany, for example, that 99% of buyers will just go to the listing broker. And that brings up a question, okay, what are you going to charge as a listing broker when a buyer comes to you? So if a buyer comes to you directly, they get the information from your listing sign, from your for sale sign, for example, how are you going to address that? Are you going to charge for your services? You probably should something, because you have additional expenses, but you also have additional risk. You now not only are dealing with a seller that might sue you, but you're also dealing with a buyer that might sue you if any of them are unhappy. And of course, you're doing all of that extra work, which is not something to be negated. And so again, you got to think this through. What does the listing agreement look like? What are the terms that you're going to put in there? Not with respect to buyer compensation if another buyer agent brings a deal, a transaction, but how about you as a listing agent? If you all of a sudden have to do both sides of the transaction, how is it going to be compensated? So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'm going to do a few more. What I would love to hear from you is your thoughts, your comments. Please don't give me any crazy ways to circumvent the rules. I don't want to have anything to do with anyone that has lack of integrity and wants to break the law, break the rules by coming up with some crazy proposals. We need to figure out how to make this work for us within the confines that we're given. And if you would like to join me on a panel, on a discussion, let's do it. This here is just very ad hoc, but we could put something together and just promote it and maybe get a few hundred or even 1,000 agents to join us on the discussion. And my goal here is to educate and empower and help you guys. And so this is the first step, by just bringing up lots of questions that I know many of you have never thought about, because I'm having one-on-one conversation, and agents are like, oh, I never even thought about that. What about the conditional withdrawal on the buyer agency agreement? And I've sent emails, by the way, to the powers that be, but I've yet to get a response. So if I do, I will let you know on a separate video. Thanks so much for tuning in. Have an amazing Friday and weekend ahead, and I hope to hear from you. You can also, direct message me. And again, this is going on like 6-7 different streams: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and so forth. So I'm going to check all of those for comments, and I will be replying personally to any and all of them. So please engage. Thank you so much, and have an amazing day.